Hi there. So we're not going to have a lot in the way of substantive new material with today's Friday's videos. One point before we finish up with the chapter 5 is talking a little bit about enforcement costs. So we've talked about how we can make axes with price and quantity. In this case, the quantity is looking at the level of pollution. We're going to draw a marginal damages curve and a marginal abatement cost curve. And the marginal abatement cost, we usually think of moving from the right to left, right? So we're currently starting at a pollution level somewhere here. How much is it going to cost us to reduce pollution, moving back on the pollution quantity? And it's going to get more and more expensive as we get closer to zero, because getting to zero pollution requires a lot. We may have to shut down whole factories or industries. And we've talked about how the efficient level of pollution is actually where we have these two curves crossing. If we go a little bit lower, then, well, we've got more in cost than we have in damages. We can actually save a little bit by scaling back our regulation, allowing a little bit more pollution. We'll have more damages, but we'll more than offset that with a decrease in our cost of abating the pollution. Likewise, if we have a spot to the right of that efficient point, well, then our pollution level is too high, our damages are higher than the costs of abating the pollution, so we'll do better by reducing pollution levels. Now, where this efficient level is matters, and we've talked a little bit about how industry, so we'll talk more about how we estimate the cost of abating pollution. One of the ways we do it is we ask industry, right? They're the experts in this stuff. They're the ones who know the technology they use. They know what sort of stuff they're putting out into the environment. Sometimes they don't know, but they're the ones in the best position to find out, right? So we ask them. They've got the expertise, they've got the ability to gather the information. What's the problem? Well, the problem is incentives, right? What incentives do they have to gather good information? They often have very poor incentives to do that. They would much rather not gather that information and let it remain kind of unknown, right? So we create these different systems to try to force them to gather that information. We have laws that say you have to do this. It's a requirement of this permit, and you need this permit to be able to do what you want to do. And if you fail to report the way you're supposed to, we often put bigger fines on failure to report sort of stuff than we do on some of these substantive violations for releasing pollutants. The reason for that is we want to gather this information. We want to know what's going on. That's critical to being able to tell where things like these curves are. And if industry is the only one who can really give us that information, we need to try to create incentives to make them be able to comply with that. All of this to say that it takes enforcement to get laws to actually work. If you have laws on the books, but they aren't doing anything, then obviously we're not going to see changes in behavior that lead us to getting to the efficient level of pollution. So if we're going to have regulation to try to bring the pollution level to the efficient level, we're going to need it to be enforceable, and that enforcement usually comes with a cost. And so we often could draw something like this. I drew a yellow curve up above the marginal abatement cost curve. What's the difference between those two? The difference is enforcement costs. If we factor in the resources it takes us to actually enforce these things, then our abatement cost curve is actually, when we add in enforcement, is actually higher than it was before. So that means society is actually spending more resources than what industry is spending, putting in scrubbers on their smokestacks or using cleaner inputs in their production process. It's also the resources that go to the EPA and other agencies that are enforcing these laws. So factoring in enforcement costs actually leads us, we were at an efficient level of pollution. I'm going to call it Q1. If we factor in the efficient level of pollution with enforcement costs, it's actually a higher level of pollution. This has essentially shifted our marginal abatement cost curve up, which this is what we talked about, how industry has this incentive to report that they have really high costs, so it looks like their curve is really high. So we have a target of efficient pollution level that is relatively high, which for them means they're not regulated as much. Well, we see a similar effect to enforcement costs. So this is one reason why, there are many reasons, but one reason why industry often butts heads with regulators. It's not just that it's not that they dislike the idea of having a clean environment, but one reason they have strong incentives not only to push for less stringent regulation on themselves, but there's also kind of an effect where if it's harder for the regulators to do their jobs, we often see that the regulators don't do their jobs quite as much. And that's not always true. There are cases where there are counterexamples to this. But we certainly see enforcement budgets being cut in big ways. And that's not necessarily because our enforcement costs are going down. There's some technological advances in using big data to identify who's really the bad perpetrators when it comes to toxic releases and stuff like that. There's some cool stuff going on that are technological advances that would have the effect of shrinking the amount of enforcement costs, but nowhere near the amount that budgets have been cut. Part of that is essentially industry lobbyists have been quite effective at pointing out that they're always butting heads, regulators and industry, and it seems like not a lot is getting done, and we've made some gains on reducing pollution, but now we seem to be at stalemate in a bunch of different areas. And so incentives matter. People are acting in ways that correspond with their incentives. This is one of the reasons why work like Elinor Ostrom's work that we talked a bit about when we were talking about the commons and public goods problems. How do we, Elinor Ostrom's work was essentially looking at how do people cooperate? How do they organize themselves in ways to decrease these enforcement costs? How do they work so that you can use norms and different cultural mechanisms to get people to comply, to want to comply with management of some sort of shared resource? That is technology that is lowering the enforcement costs, which allows us to go to a lower efficient pollution level. So there are some thoughts on enforcement costs and how they fit into this big picture with marginal abatement cost curve and marginal damages.